Yes, folks, there's not a great deal of difference between Scott Morrison and Jacinda Ardern. They both operate off the same authoritarian playbook. No, ScoMo, mandatory vaccines are a no-go. Now, as far as vaccines go, at this stage I really don't have a problem with them. In fact, I've been getting the flu jab for years now because it seems to work for me. And as far as I'm aware, no government agency has been tracking me as yet. But I'm really not so sure about the future, especially when Bill Gates is involved. Anyway, today I'll start this off with ScoMo.
But this is like any vaccine. And as you know, I have a pretty strong view on vaccines, being the social services minister that introduced no jab, no play.
Yeah, no jab, no work, no jab, no pension, no jab, no passport, no jab, no driver's license, and the list goes on and on.
What is important to understand with any of these vaccines, it does protect you, it does protect your family, but it also protects the community. And as is the case with any vaccine, there will be some individuals who, for quite precise medical reasons, there can be issues with a particular vaccine. They and their safety and their health depends on the vaccine's take up more broadly in the community. That's how they get protected. And this is an important part of our vaccine strategy, not just on COVID-19, but more broadly. So we will be seeking its most widespread application, as we do with all important vaccines. But Paul, you may want to talk about...
Yeah, and this is how ScoMo will achieve this.
Gee, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? Let's bring in Nine political editor Chris Uhlmann. Chris, good morning to you. That range of opinion demonstrating the job ahead for the PM.
Yeah, there is a job ahead, obviously, in convincing people to take it, but I really, for the life of me, can't see why, Carl. If you don't have a genuine health reason for not taking this, then you're an idiot. Because has anyone seen a plan B? Look at those people in Victoria this morning. Is that the way they imagine they want to live the rest of their lives? Without a vaccine, there is no way out of this crisis, and we will...
Absolute garbage. Sweden has done it, and I'll play a video of that a bit later.
Will bounce into and out of lockdowns from now into the foreseeable future. Our economy will be destroyed. We're already going to suffer for decades because of this. So the big problem we've got at the moment, Carl, is that there isn't actually a vaccine, and the best possible chance of one isn't until the middle of next year.
Chris,
and by then, enormous damage will be done.
You know only too well, Chris, that there are people who have dramas and problems with vaccines that have been proven for decades, let alone one that's been rushed through.
Yeah, look, I think people have very short memories. I had two uncles who had polio. One was left with a terrible limp for the rest of his life. Then we had smallpox. If people don't understand by now that vaccination has helped prolong the life of most humans on this planet, then, as I say, you really are an idiot. And if you look around yourselves at the moment and see the way that we're living our lives and think that if there is a vaccine available that you shouldn't take it, then you shouldn't be surprised, Carl, if governments do start to use some of the levers they have.
Here it comes.
They don't make it compulsory, but at the moment you might have noticed too, they can make you stay at home, locked in your house. They can lock you out of pubs and clubs and the country if they decide there could be a health passport to get around. So think about the consequences.
So I wonder why then the Prime Minister said yesterday, I think on Neil Mitchell's show on 3AW in Melbourne, that it would be mandatory. And then he kind of said later on, mandatory as possible, or words to that effect. Why did he back up on that?
Yeah, well, he misspoke, Carl. He can't make it mandatory. It is a democracy. In the end, people have the right even to be a fool. We see that all the time. So he can't take that right away from people, but the government can make other decisions. The Australian government gets to decide whether or not you get a passport to get into and out of this country. Well, you know, that might be something that is put on the table. And by the way, at the moment, with everything that people are saying about what governments might or might do, again, look at what's happening. Governments are making this up as they go along. So at this stage, no one's come up with any ideas for this, but you could imagine that state governments might demand that children have a jab before they go to school, as we see now with some of the social security stuff, that people might demand that you have a health passport before you get into a pub or a club, and pubs and clubs might do that to protect themselves. So there are plenty of ways that you can encourage people to take this, but sure...
Yeah. And this is not fiction, people. Morrison is going to do this.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister suggested that he'd like to force Australians to take his vaccine for the safety of all.
I would expect it to be as mandatory as you can possibly make it. There are always exemptions for any vaccine on medical grounds, but that should be the only basis.
Now, it's true, the Chinese vaccine, it doesn't seem to have been properly tested. An Australian one, though, should be. Even so, by late yesterday, Morrison sounded like he'd realised he's gone too far, saying they wanted mandatory, said, well, no, we can't actually force people to have an injection. But today, it seemed like the government was back indeed again. Chinese mode of thought, Chinese dictatorship will make life very hard for you if you don't take its vaccine, if there is one. You probably won't get your social security payments. You probably won't be allowed to send your child to childcare or to school. One of the government's health experts said you might not be allowed to travel or go to restaurants.
Here it comes.
Here's the Health Minister today.
Would you consider making incentives for people to be vaccinated, such as no jab policy?
We certainly would encourage as many people as possible. We'd like to see a take-up of up to 95%, which is where we're at with our children's immunisation rates, 94.77% announced on the weekend, record rate. So we're doing the right thing as a country. We have absolutely kept on the table concepts such as no jab, no pay, no jab, no play.
No jab, no pay. No jab, no play.
Things that we're all already doing that have helped Australia have one of the highest childhood immunisation rates in the world, and that saves lives and protects lives.
So would you link it to welfare payments, to school attendance, to travel, maybe even going to sporting events or restaurants?
We reserve the right, subject to medical advice, to take steps that might assist.
Now, I'm going to say I find that rather troubling, and I don't think it's just going to scare those anti-vaxxers out there that think it's all a plot to, whatever. I'd probably take a vaccine, sure. But I also, by hell, I do not want to be forced to take it by my government. It must be my decision about what's injected into my body.
Exactly. And don't be deluded, people. Jacinda will follow Morrison. This is what she's doing right now with testing.
That I wanted to, I've got a number of questions about people refuse, what do we do if someone refuses to be tested? Well, they can't now. If someone refuses in our facilities to be tested, they have to keep staying. So they won't be able to leave after 14 days. They have to stay on for another 14 days. So it's a pretty good incentive. You either get your tests done and make sure you're cleared, or we will keep you in a facility longer. So I think most people will look at that and say, I'll take the test.
Yeah. Anyway, now to Sweden.
Here's a very good article by Swedish Dr. Sebastian Rushworth, published on August 4th, 2020, titled, How Bad is COVID Really? He notes he is a doctor working in an emergency room in one of the biggest hospitals in Stockholm, Sweden. He says Sweden is perhaps the country that has taken the most relaxed attitude of any towards the COVID pandemic. Sweden never went into complete lockdown. Businesses remained open. Schools remained open. Restaurants remained open. And yet very few people have bothered with face masks. He said in mid-March, COVID hit Stockholm like a storm. Practically everybody who was tested had COVID. He said then a few months later, after COVID, all the COVID patients disappeared. He said it is now 4 months since the start of the pandemic, and I haven't seen a single COVID patient in over a month. He said at the peak 3 months ago, 100 people a day were dying in Sweden, but now it's only 5 people approximately per day who are dying, and that number continues to drop. He said that means that virtually no one is getting infected anymore. In other words, they have herd immunity. He says basically COVID is over and done with in Sweden after 4 months. And epidemiologist Newt Witkowski talked about this. If you just let it go through and do its thing, it will be over in a few months. He says COVID has killed fewer than 6,000 people in a country of 10 million. In Sweden, the annual death rate in Sweden is around 100,000 people who die. He says considering 70% of those who died of COVID are over the age of 80, quite a few of those 6,000 would have died this year anyway, and that makes COVID merely a blip in terms of its effect on mortality. He says that's why it is nonsensical to compare COVID to other major pandemics like the 2018 pandemic. He said, and yet many countries have shut down their entire economies, shutting down schools, making large portions of the population unemployed in order to deal with this disease. He says, considering that most people in Sweden are leading their lives normally now, not socially distancing and not wearing masks, there should be a high rate of infections, but in fact there are not. He talks about there is T-cell immunity. A lot of people have talked about that. You don't need antibodies. You can have T-cell immunity and be immune to this. But the media is making out, oh my God, very few people have antibodies. He says everybody he works with in the emergency room has done the antibody test, but very few actually have the antibodies. Now, the point of this is, comment from me, is at some point they may tell you, oh, you don't have the antibodies, so you need to get a vaccine. No, you don't. He says, but COVID is over in Sweden. People have gone back to their normal lives. He said, if only 6,000 people are dead out of 5 million infected, he's guessing half the country's been infected. He said that works out to a case fatality rate of 0.12%, roughly the same as the regular old flu.
Yeah, and that's the point, isn't it? Yeah. Now, if Dr. Sebastian Rushworth is correct, Sweden doesn't even require a vaccine. They're miles ahead of us now, and we could be going in and out of lockdowns for years to come. Anyway, as predicted, the lockdowns continue in New Zealand.